for preventing insider threats. And Michael, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Chris, for the great introduction, and thank you everyone for joining today. So I'm Michael Ruddy, and I am Senior Technical Evangelist at Varonis Corporation. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about something called insider threat, malice, mistakes, and mountain lions. All of the slides that you see here today will be available through CStore, and of course there's our bit.ly ad as well to capture this information from the Varonis side of the house. So a little bit about myself briefly. My background is a little bit unique in that I am a systems engineer who went to law school, and I never took the bar exam. I like to tell the joke that my parents are not very proud, but I really am proud in the fact that when we talk about information governance and data governance, and we talk about legality and compliance, I'm able to speak two languages, and so in that, I'm continually fascinated with things like risk and e-discovery and data management and the next new thing. And so finally, I love to tell stories, and we'll tell a few stories today as we go through the presentation. And so this will not be a technical deep dive. It will really be more about some use case applications that hopefully apply to many of you that are on the phone here today. So Varonis Corporation, we are publicly traded. We started operations in 2005. We both, this number is actually a little bit low. We are well over 3,500 customers, headed towards 4,000. We make software solutions for human-generated data. What does that mean? So human-generated data, very simply, is just a very elegant word for unstructured data, the data that you and I create day-to-day in our day-to-day lives within an organization, whether that be files, spreadsheets, video, audio presentations, PowerPoint presentations and the like, and collaborative tools like SharePoint. And so a little story about how we actually started. Varonis actually started with our two founders, Yaki Feidelson and Ohad Korkus, who were NetApp engineers and consultants who were working for a major oil and gas company off the coast of Angola in West Africa. What was interesting is that they were essentially supporting the NetApp filers there, and they were about $100 million headed towards $200 to $300 million worth of undersea water images taken by submarines, divers, and very expensive equipment of the ocean floor for seismic activity and the ability to drill. Well, unfortunately, one day they came in and the slides were missing. The files were gone. And the first question was asked was, well, who did it? Where did it go? Was it sabotage? Was it a competitor? Was it somebody from the inside? What actually happened, and who captured this information? Now, remember, this was 1995, so we were just a few years outside of floppy disks, and even NAS-attached storage was not as proliferate as we see today. So Ohad and Yaki actually spent the better part of a night, narrowed it down to about 1,000 possible suspects, and the oil and gas company came back and said, well, why don't we know who did this, or why don't we know who touched these files? And the answer was a very obvious one for those of us who are system administrators. We don't capture that level of information of logging simply because we'd have to stand up probably 2 servers for every server just to capture that level of activity. Well, unfortunately, as a result of that, Varonis was actually born out of that need. And so here we are in business. So today what we'll talk about are 4 things. We'll talk about the anatomy of insider breaches. We'll talk about some real-world examples of breaches and some of the statistics that exist in the marketplace. And then we'll talk about stories that are really our own human irrational biases about risk and how we tend to approach things. And then finally, I'll give you the 6 mitigating tips to mitigate insider threats. So when we look at insider threats, there are typically three casts of characters that usually are involved in these types of events. The first, of course, is the turncloak. Now, on the left, we see the woman with the bow and arrow. I call her Laura Croft. She looks like Tomb Raider. And this is typically an insider in an organization who has legitimate credentials, but for whatever reason, they've gone rogue. This is an employee who is perhaps unhappy. They may have been terminated. They're looking to leave. Any number of reasons, or perhaps they're selling in secrets to another company, competitor, external governments, any number of different breaches. And so this is typically this is the person of most concern as a general rule. The second one is the pawn, and we see our guy here playing looks like Xbox, and he is an insider. Now, he has not done anything wrong by design, but unfortunately, he or she may have fat-fingered a file erroneously, copied it to the wrong place, or in some instances simply sent an email to a person that was not designated to be received in the first place. However, the pawn is unfortunately a likely target. On the far right is really where we in the security space tend to fixate on, and that is the imposter. This is someone who is coming in with legitimate credentials, like the other two on the left. They have basically, their goal is to basically get inside the organization, access their credentials, exfiltrate, and see if we can elevate their access and permissions, and then exfiltrate and get that data out for about setting off a lot of bells and alarms. And so basically we have these three characters or these three actors when we look at an insider threat. So when we look at an insider threat, it usually takes one of several forms. But by and large, if I were to choose a methodology on how to get inside an organization, I would choose phishing. Why? Well, very simply, phishing as an industry has a 90% success rate of getting clicked on. That means an email that essentially shows up in your inbox has a 90% chance of being clicked on. Now, I don't want to scare anyone because essentially the industry, phishing, has an 18% overall success rate. That means simply 90% of the people will see something in an inbox, click on it, and whether software will encounter it and deflect it, or they will realize this doesn't look like a legitimate email at this point, and it will go nowhere. But the success rate is down to 18%. The next thing they want to do is, once they've gotten inside, is to snoop around and look at access and look at any possibility where they can extract this information. And finally, on the far right, exfiltration. Get that information out without sounding off a lot of alarms and bells and whistles. And sadly enough, in this industry today, more than often, we do not have the alarms and bells and whistles in place that actually do let us know that something like this has taken place. Why? More than often, the solutions and tools we have tend to go off and ring and scream wolf more times than we care to, or simply we don't realize it until days or months afterwards, after this has taken place. If you can see the bottom script, there's a simple find string command. If anybody on the phone recognizes what that is, I usually like to show this visually, but we don't have the ability to do responses right now on the phone. But basically, it is a Visa card number. Someone can actually go in with a simple find string command and basically put in the format for a Visa card number. And if they have permissions to access across those different stores, across those different silos and repositories, they can actually bring back sensitive, at-risk information like credit card numbers. So it's very real, because when we look at the type of errors that take place when we have insider threats, there are majority, as I mentioned earlier when we talked about the pawn, are misdeliveries. They're publishing errors, they're disposal errors. They've been disposed of in the wrong way, they were published the wrong way, or somebody sent it to the wrong person. And of course, on the right, we see the different data types, but documents tend to lead the way, with web applications and desktops following suit. The numbers are very real, though. When we look at insider misuse, privilege abuse is the greatest amount. And so much so that there have been recent commissions and surveys that have been done that point to some of these levels of misuse within the organization. And we find that even the analysts like Gartner and Forrester are starting to analyze this as well, because the threat is very, very real. When we look at these things, we think of hackers, we think of elegant people like, perhaps if you've seen the movie Mission Impossible and the Ving Rhames character, who's using a lot of elegant spy tools. But believe it or not, sometimes when we talk about insider threats, we as humans are in fact our own worst enemy. Here on the left, we see that somebody has actually posted on Twitter. They are a Lady Gaga fan, and they're saying, "My new credit card, OMG, I'm so happy." And here we are, posted for the world to see is their new credit card number. And fortunately, the security code is on the back. But if this were an American Express card, where the security code is on the front, somebody would basically go shopping with that person's credit card, and it wouldn't take very long before, at some point they would be contacted for fraud and misuse. On the right-hand side, we see something that even systems administrators sometimes we tend to do. Many don't realize that simple things like the web.config file, that when we upload that to the server, that is also indexed by Google. And if you can see in yellow and highlighted, clear text passwords are showing right there. So here it is. We've gone through a lot of trouble to secure and vanguard our own security, our own web pages, etc. And yet something as inadvertent as copying a web config file with passwords can be exposed for the world to see. So the threats are in fact very real, and we don't have to use a lot of elegant tools. Simple tools like a tool called Everything or Microsoft Find can basically go out and counter this information. Why? Because the users perhaps don't realize, or administrators don't realize, that users have access to resources, file shares, mailboxes, SharePoint sites, and all types of unstructured data that are way beyond the scope of their jobs. Users accessing information within the legal department, trade secrets, sensitive HR information, risky information such as social security numbers, credit card numbers, etc. And it's very easy to get. So Target, the poster child for security breaches, they had a $162 million breach. And Target had a lot of very fancy tools watching the perimeter. They had a lot of smart people working there. But I call Target the candy bar syndrome, or the Mentos syndrome. It has a very hard shell exterior, but a very soft interior. And what that simply means is that they had a lot of elegant tools, but nobody really took the time to say, my goodness, we have a refrigeration company that has access to our point-of-sale system and passwords, and people from that refrigeration company will access the system and put the password on a sticky note up on a water cooler, maybe perhaps we can get breached. And literally that, in essence, that was what happened. An analyst at Gardner by the name of Aviva Latal is a very smart person who said that context-aware behavioral analytics could have prevented the target breach. What do we mean? Talk more about this in just a second. But behavioral analytics is something that has a lot of interest within the industry, and we at Varonis have been there for years, but now suddenly it is coming to the forefront. But before we talk about behavioral analytics, I want to talk a little bit about risk and irrational biases we have as humans. Now, typically I'll ask this at a trade show or wherever I'm speaking. I'll say, most people within the audience, if you are simply dealing with the fear factor, measuring the cost, measuring fear within yourself, what is most frightening to you? Slipping in the shower or being attacked by a mountain lion? Now sometimes I have people who say to me, well, I live in New York City, so we won't likely see a mountain lion, and that's very true. But just simply the fear factor of one of those two events happening to you, which is the most frightening? And of course, the majority of the room will raise their hands and say the mountain lion, and that's true. Yet the irony is that most likely, most of us will slip in the fall, or potentially slip and fall in the shower and not be attacked by a mountain lion in our lifetime. Fear and frequency. Another example of breaches we talk about is that a large university had in the Midwest had 146,000 student records, including social security numbers, that were exposed for the internet to see. What was the cause? Was it a breach? Was it somebody hacking from the inside? No. It was very simply a graduate student responsible for the IT department who simply placed that flat file within a public folder for everyone to see. And unfortunately, copies were made before they realized what the content that was actually exposed in there. Copy and paste is very real, so much so that Verizon commissioned a survey called a data breach investigative survey that shows some of the numbers that actually happen through simple fat fingering, copy and pasting, or inadvertently sending information out to the wrong people. I'll tell you a quick story about trees, and this looks like the movie Avatar, but it's not. And this is basically built on a Jared Smith, a famous anthropologist, who basically just did discovery out in the wild, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. And what he found after years and years of studying this information, and he was a mathematician as well as a paleontologist, was that when he went out in the woods of New Guinea and they would see these very large trees that would spawn upwards of 200 feet, what he found was each night when he was ready to sort of set up tent and go to sleep for the night, the native New Guineans, the people of the trail, the people who helped him on the trail and helped him in the woods, in the bush, would often say, we're not going to sleep under the tree, we're going to sleep out in the open. And he'd say, why? Why would you do that? Why would you sleep out in the elements where you're under shade or cover from the tree? The answer was, many of them would say, the trees are dead. And he said, yes, they are dead, in fact, but some of these trees are 100 years old, and they won't fall probably for another 50 or 100 years. The native New Guineans would simply refuse. What Jared Smith realized many years later, after spending nights and nights in the woods and out in the bush in New Guinea, was that every night he was in the woods, a tree fell. He could hear one falling. And so when he came to the when he did a frequency analysis, being a mathematician, and came to the realization that, you know what, if the chance of a tree falling in the woods any one particular night is 1 in 1,000, if after the course of 3 years, I will essentially be killed being crushed under a tree falling. What that meant was simply that which was mathematically, which seemed unlikely or infeasible, now suddenly became a reality. And so what happens is when we go back to the shower analogy or the mountain lion analogy, what we think is simply not a threat and is commonplace does become common. And what we fear is that seems to be the extreme, such as being attacked by a mountain lion or being hacked into, becomes very, very real with a number of permutations. So in real-world examples, you know, it's great sometimes that we have systems administrators that focus on 256-level encryption and DoD-level encryption, and let's build out these MD5 hashes and a lot of different things, yet not realizing that people basically will put their passwords up with a sticky in their you know, or write this basically on their notebook or write this on their cubicle somewhere where everybody can see. We spend too much time focusing perhaps on that which is extreme and extraordinary, hacking it with the power of hacking something, you know, 1 in 10 million, as opposed to something simple where simply user behavior comes into play. So it's very real when we look at frequency. And so somebody has infiltrated your environment. They're in. Now what do we do? Well, if we think of the Snowden story, and that tells a great story, are 6 things that we need to do to mitigate these types of tips. The first thing we want to do is eliminate global access. What do I mean? Well, if anybody is a systems administrator or if you've dealt with Windows, you know that there are global access groups, such as the Everyone group. And so what we find is that people sometimes, in organizations, you've inherited systems that have these security groups and permissions that are open for all the world to see. The next thing we want to do is eliminate those excessive permissions, whether it be those global access groups or perhaps people in departments who should not be seeing this information. Next, I'd like to alert on privilege escalations, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Behavioral deviations, and this is where our user behavioral analytics comes into play. Another thing that we do is we occasionally, sometimes, if we are a company that is highly at risk or risk exposure, we want to set up honeypots. And then finally, we want to closely monitor high-risk people and the data that's associated with that. I'll tell you more about what that means. So the first one, global access groups, people located in the everyone group or authenticated users groups. And what we find is when we go into many of our customers at Varonis and install our software and it goes out and calls the environment, it comes back with astonishing results. Many customers don't realize that because we've gone through many iterations of systems administrators, many people who have permissions to create these folders and shares and access to different mailboxes and SharePoint groups and sites, we find that, oh my gosh, we are exposed. Our intellectual property, our trade secrets, our human resource information, things that should not be seen, everyone has access to. So how can we do this and perhaps remediate and go in and tighten up those security groups without cutting off legitimate access and hindering the flow of business on a daily basis? The next thing is we want to eliminate excessive permissions. You know, maybe perhaps somebody who works in the coffee shop but simply has an ID on the network, maybe they shouldn't be seeing things from the legal department or perhaps the financial department, especially when we have a shareholders meeting coming up within a week and suddenly they can access certain spreadsheets. So let's set that up so that what people should have access to and should not have access to that, and then basically set up periodic entitlement reviews so we can go back and look at this periodically and go to the business owners and say, do you own this department? Do you own these shares? Do you own this information? Do you own these particular mailboxes? Great. Let's see who basically has accessing this on a regular basis, who's using it, and who should not be using it. And so the owners of business end up taking the role of security within their hands. The next thing is privilege escalations. And this is very simple. You know, the foxes can't watch the hen house, and yet at the same time, even systems administration people, we need to monitor them. If somebody becomes a domain admin, if somebody gets access to the CEO's mailbox, or perhaps the head of marketing's SharePoint site and folders, we need to be able to know that so that there's a log kept of information when somebody has escalations, their privileges have been increased. Tip number 4, behavioral deviations, and this is where we call user behavior analytics. And I'll spend a little bit of time on this because this is probably the biggest trend in the industry is where we are looking at user behavior. And what we're doing is we're setting up a flat line or a level set, if you will, of what is normal user behavior. What do I mean? Well, for example, if perhaps I as an employee, my name is Michael, and at Varonis I am copying down on average about anywhere from 10 to about 25 files a day up to the network, down to the network, or accessing specific mailboxes or accessing even my boss's mailbox about 2 to 3 times a day, that's considered normal behavior. And the system is monitoring this. But supposedly on a Friday, maybe December 31st, all of a sudden I copied down about 400 files. And now maybe I didn't get a bonus from Varonis, maybe perhaps I'm looking to leave or defect or go to another company, but immediately that behavior is not a normal for somebody within my department, within my role, or my normal user behavior that the system's been logging. And that's what we call, that's just one example, what we call the early resignation detection system. This will actually trigger an alert that will basically send a report, trigger a pager number, trigger any number of different things within the system, perhaps even shutting down my account because now perhaps I'm doing something that could potentially hurt the company. And so that's important. So this is just one example of user behavioral analytics, which could have prevented things like the Snowden breach had the NSA had something in place that said this is normal behavior and this is not normal behavior. Tip number 5, CryptoLocker. Now, many organizations, if you've lived through this, it is painful. And so what happens is CryptoLocker and other types of ransomware are rampant within the industry. And so one of the things that we can detect, again, with the user behavior analytics and the fact that we are logging every touch point that happens within the system, every file open, every email that's sent, every copy, every delete, every move, every access to a specific SharePoint site, we can alert over 100 file modify events. And so with something like CryptoLocker, which comes in through a legitimate user access, and suddenly all of a sudden starts changing files or file extensions, and 300 file extensions have changed in the last 5 minutes, and all of a sudden this funny little payload file has been loaded, and that means, guess what, it's ransomware, and that means pay us $10 million in Bitcoin, or basically your files will be deleted and you'll never get them back again. And we can do that. We can detect that level of information with things like CryptoLocker. But not only can we do that, we can grab that username and machine, check the machine's registry, change the value, lock it down, lock down the account, and kick off a CryptoLocker cleanup tool automatically, long before the damage has been done. Set up honeypots. Now, some organizations like to do this, others do not. It's an ethical matter, but we find that sometimes if we set up shared folders, and such as payroll, confidential, and CEO, we can actually go in and see after about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, who's been abusing it, who's been looking around or snooping or opening files. Now, some people would say this is an entrapment. I don't know that it is or it isn't, but the important thing is we have the ability to detect user behavior simply by setting up the honeypot. And then finally, high-risk information. We need to be able to monitor this, and one of the capabilities that Varonis has is not only do we capture every touch point, every access point, every event that happens within the life of the information and the stores of the unstructured data that we're monitoring, but we can find out sensitive data that exists. When we go out and scan, our data classification tool can tell you, not only does John Smith have improper access to our legal folder, but guess what? There are 500 social security numbers. There are 300 human resource records. There are trade secrets within there. There are anything that is sensitive or considered high risk. We leak that information, whether an employee or somebody else gets that information or exfiltrates or grabs it, or any number of reasons, we have the ability to monitor high-risk people and high-risk data. And so we can automatically move that information to perhaps a safer location or be able to basically redact it and hold it back so that when a user goes in and scrolls through those directories, because they're not a member of a security group, because they're not part of the legal team or the financial department, they will not see information with social security numbers or with credit card numbers or health records or HR records, et cetera, et cetera. So in closing, one of the things that we do, Varonis, we offer is a free threat assessment. And yes, it is in fact free. We come in and we are able to install our software within about 90 minutes. We will let it run for about a week or two, and we'll come back and help you do an analysis and let you know where you are exposed, where there is risk, where the information basically perhaps needs cleanup or remediation, and some of the other tools that we talked about today. So I hope this was helpful today, and I thank everyone for their time and the folks at C-Store. And I've ended about 2 minutes early. Chris?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks to everyone. At this time, we will open it up for Q&A. As a reminder, if you have any questions regarding today's presentation, please post them to the questions pane, and we'll field them now. So it looks like we do have a couple of questions coming in, Michael. The first question, do you see ransomware as a major threat? This is probably, I guess, akin to maybe, let's say a good analogy might be food poisoning, right? If you've never gotten food poisoning, you really think it's not going to happen to you. So, but once you have it, your risk goes up and your tolerance for that risk goes down. So, what are your thoughts on that front?
So thank you for that. When I typically speak to audiences, usually when I ask how many of you have been affected by CryptoLocker, usually 1 out of 4, 1 out of 5 in the room will raise their hand. And out of those number of people, I would say about 70% were able to get around it. But 30% basically were damaged quite badly. They either did not get the files back, they did not, they were basically held for ransom. They won't disclose that, obviously, at many of the forums where I speak, whether they actually did pay the ransomware. But it's very difficult to track, unfortunately, because they do require that you pay through Bitcoin. And if you try to track it by IP, you'll see that that IP address basically pings everywhere from Germany to Bangladesh to Hawaii to Croatia, back over to Texas, and then down to South America, and loops back around to the Middle East as well. So any number of different areas. So it's very difficult to track. And so it is a very real threat. CryptoLocker and ransomware, it's become very much a real threat. And so we see a lot of us within the security space looking at that and really addressing that. But what we find within the space is that many of folks within the industry, and we work with companies that have SIM solutions and AIM solutions and, of course, firewalls and have very elegant tools, we deal with the data that's at rest. A lot of them have dealt with the ability to detect ransomware and things like that, but really the ransomware, things like CryptoLocker don't really appear until the data is literally at rest. It doesn't usually happen with the data in flight. And the reason why is simply they can grab a larger corpus of data when the data is simply at rest and go for an entire directory, tree structure, hard disk, NAS device, or SAM, and go for one fell swoop as opposed to bits and pieces that are basically data that's happening in flight. So it's very real.
Excellent, thank you. I think hopefully that'll be a good wake-up call maybe for folks that didn't think it could happen to them, I guess. We do have another question here, Michael. How does the Varonis solution help with discovery of electronic documents and litigation or arbitration, for example?
So e-discovery has very much been the linchpin for a lot that's happening within the industry. And so when we look at information governance and data governance, what we're finding is that all the lines of business, IT, legal, HR, compliance, whatever exists within your company, everyone wants to now look at the data because they have a vested stake in the data. So if you think of a hub and spoke approach, at the center is all the data and information in the center, and we can extract value from it. As far as electronic discovery, when we have to turn this over, and we do live in a litigious society, we find that simply those records, the emails, the files, the folders, need to be turned over to the court. And that ends up being a mining expedition sometimes, when an archaeology expedition, I should say, sometimes, to find that information. And there are a lot of great e-discovery tools on the market. But what they don't provide you is really what happened within the life of that data. More specifically, they don't provide the context around that data. And so the fact that Varonis, we can provide you not only we can have a search tool that can go out and find those files, find that information based on keywords, based on Boolean, based on logic. But not only that, we can only tell you what happened in the life of that event. So we can say that that employee did not send that email, they did not open that file, they did not move or copy it or move it to the trash can. We have not only an audit trail that gives you the most corroboratable audit trail legally, a defensible audit trail, because we can tell you every touch point. When that employee or whomever from the outside came in, opened that file, moved it, deleted it, copied, did any number of different things. And so not only are we giving you the actual file and the information itself, we're giving you the context around it and basically the audit trail on everything that happened in terms of the life cycle of that piece of data. And so that makes for a very defensible strategy, which nobody else in the industry provides. So we're proud of that.
Excellent, thank you. We do have another question coming in. What will prevent an insider who has knowledge of Varonis being installed from skewing the data by downloading large amounts of data when a baseline is being created?
So what happens is, that's a great question. So what happens is, it sort of answers its own question in that the baseline is being created, but it's, I gave the example of myself being leaving the company and starting my own company, and suddenly I copy 300 files down within a 5 or 10 minute period, where normally I copy 20 files a day. You know, unless that user basically is baselining where they're copying about 300 files a day, that simply isn't normal. And so basically when we see that spike, when we see that delta, one of the other things that we do, that triggers the alert. So one of the other things that we do in addition to that is we look at user behavior within others within your department or group or security group. So in other words, we can say we both work perhaps in the marketing department, and what does that look like if John Smith's behavior is different from mine as Michael within the marketing department, and we compare that and we look at that and baseline it, so that not only are we looking at individual behavior, but we look at it across groups or others within your same role and department. And so from there, we have an algorithm that is very elegant and very smart that can detect things like even not just whether we see these large spikes, but perhaps going to file and folder shares, which they normally don't access. Suddenly, they're accessing the marketing department, but suddenly we see them sneaking around within the financial area or the financial SharePoint site, or suddenly going into the head of legal's mailbox, because maybe it's an admin assistant who has access to his or her boss's information, and they worked in legal several years ago. That's not normal behavior, and suddenly that will trigger an event and trigger an alarm.
Excellent, thank you. It sounds like that behavioral analytics is really key and quite a bit advanced from where we've been in the past. So at this time, that does conclude our Q&A. Thank you so much, Michael, for the great information, great presentation, and wonderful stories, certainly that brought everything to life. Thank you to everyone attending for your time and attention.